If you have a crisis in leadership and you question the viability of your executive director of your nonprofit, what do you do? How do you oust the leader of your organization? Today, we're going to have that conversation. Hey, so I am Chris Wink. I'm the publisher of Generocity.org, nonprofit and social impact news site. We're talking about something that you might think is controversial. How do you oust? How do you remove your executive director of a nonprofit? This is both legal, social, mission impact, and we're going to talk through some of those issues. This is not going to be official legal advice. This is instead going to be a starting point for how might you think about this if, as a board member or an employee, you are losing faith in leadership of your organization. To do that, I am joined by two experts on the matter. I have Fernando Chang-Muy, and I have Shani Akilah. Shani's from Black and Brown Workers Cooperative. Fernando, you are from the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you guys for being here.
Our pleasure.
Indeed. And Shani, we have additional expertise we've called in.
Yes, my father.
Right, exactly. So let's start with like some basics. You know, we're talking to a board member or a worker who might genuinely not know the severity, and they're just like feeling that first bit of I'm not sure I have a lot of faith in my executive director. If you were just having a conversation with a person who hadn't yet done a lot of the homework, what's like the starting point of I don't know if I have faith in my executive director? What do I first got to do? What's my homework I got to do to have done due diligence?
Absolutely. So I think this is a really great question. And I think one that a lot of workers and board members, but I would focus on workers for this because often workers are not as privy, or sometimes they're not even given access to sort of the policies on paper of the organization, right? Often when we work with when workers reach out to us, this is the first question they ask, right? And so there's a few things that we usually name, right? The first thing is really basic, but challenging in a culture that undermines workers, I would argue. Trust your intuition and trust your voice, right? If you are experiencing something with somebody who holds a higher position within your organization, like an executive director, often it is normal to go through this process internally of, well, maybe I'm just being too sensitive, or, maybe this is something that I do, maybe I'm imagining this, or right? No, continue to pay attention to that feeling. And as it comes up, document it, write it down. Within our cooperative, we talk about the incident log, right? And so, date, time, what happened. And this part is important, how it made you feel, right? I mean, often when people are thinking about this, they're like, well, I don't want to seem overly sensitive, so I don't want to focus too much on my feelings. No. Focus on your feelings, because that is what shows us impact, right? The impact it is having on you in your job, the quality of work you're able to deliver based on the experiences you're having with this executive director. And it can be also helpful to write down folks that have witnessed it. And it's important to make sure that these are folks that you really feel are in your corner, and to really sort of vet that, right? And so don't write someone down that they have no idea you're doing this incident log, and they have no idea that you're experiencing levels of discomfort with somebody in power, right? So that is the thing to start with, is documenting, because it then creates a narrative and shows consistency in these occurrences over time.
Shani, that is really good, and I really like that, because I gotta feel like, if, as you're alluding to, if someone is worried about being too harsh, you've kind of said, look, well, that's fine. If only one small thing ever happens, okay, then all right, let it go. Maybe you're just moderately annoyed at something. But if you start filling out that log and it gets easier, and you talk to some other coworkers, then you might start feeling like, well, there's something here. That seems important, right? So that you're also saying it's okay. You can have those conversations with teammates. It doesn't have to be seen as like, forgive the language, but it doesn't have to be shit talking. You can just say like, how are you feeling? And if folks are having similar concerns, that might be important.
Absolutely.
That's great. All right. Fernando, I wonder. I mean, you have experience on both sides, but I wonder also for board members. Are there folks like if you just have that, you're sitting in that board meeting, you're like, this doesn't sound quite like what I want my ED to be talking about or doing. Are there first steps that you'd say there?
Yeah, so in addition to what Shani said, which is an excellent advice to document, I'm going to give a slightly legal and then non-legal suggestion. So first of all, look at the contract. When you hired the person, was there a contract that specified two things? One is, does the contract specify grounds for ousting or firing? Ousting is your word. And secondly, is there a process? Now, in the absence of a contract, and by the way, before I leave that, the contract, the thing that the executive director signed may say, you may be discharged for the following instances, including but not limited to stealing money, running around naked, whatever it is. So it might list areas for discharge. So look at the contract. And then secondly, that contract might say, like three strikes and you're out. First, you'll get a notice. Then we'll give you a week or a month or a year or whatever. So the contract is the first thing I would like to suggest that people look at. In addition to Shani's great point, is start documenting everything that's been going on, so that you can show that you and your colleagues are not crazy in following the chain of command. And again, is there a process or a chain of command? Number one. Number two. Pennsylvania is an employment at will state, so board members need to know that. We don't have to give an excuse, but we do have to give I shouldn't use the word excuse, or reason if there is a contract. And thirdly, again, people need to be mindful of equal employment opportunity laws. You just can't oust or fire someone based on race, religion, etc. So you have to balance both things. What's going on in the workplace? And is there a contract that, I guess I'll use the word, protects the person? And maybe we'll get into this a little bit later, Chris. Oops. But how did we even get here? So this chat we're having is how to oust. Maybe you're going to have another webinar later on how to support executive directors, so you don't get to this discussion that we're having today. How do we fire the sucker? So I like to think that at the board level as well as the staff, I like to think of a college process. We recruit you, we orient you during freshman week, we mentor you for 4 years or 3 years or whatever, or 6 years now it's to graduate out of college. And then we, during those years, we support you and your mentor, and then we graduate you. So at the workplace, was there a system to recruit people based on skills, or did you just hire this executive director just out of nowhere? And then did we support you throughout your process? Did we evaluate you every 6 months or every year? So I would like to ask, for those listening, how do we even get to this place? What was the process? Did the board not evaluate the executive director regularly, whatever regularly means? Did the executive director not meet with staff regularly, whatever regularly means? So how did we get here? So that's what I'd like folks to be thinking about, rather than just jumping in. Were there circumstances to even avoid this awkward, weird situation we're in, where we're talking about firing this person?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're hitting on a couple themes that we absolutely will dive into both here and elsewhere, but I want to touch on them first right at the outset. One, I want to flag that, of course, reason we start with this, these are really serious steps to take. So that's why I love Shani's point of, if you first are having this idea, you do got to do a little homework. You got to make sure that this is something more than a brief, incident of disagreement. But also, I think something that a conversation like this is challenged by is there's such a huge range of reasons we could be talking about, right? Like financial or racial or sexual malfeasance is one really big category. I don't think this person generally represents us well. There's a huge range. And I wonder if either of you guys have a lot of thoughts about, if you were talking to a friend who's going through this, how you would help them sort where on the spectrum of severity their concerns are? Did you guys have, Shani, you spoke a little bit about feeling, but I wonder if do you guys I have any methods for folks to get like where on the spectrum of severity are my concerns? Yeah, Shani, I don't.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, I unmuted you for a second. Yeah, my fault.
No problem.
I did that during
I do know.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. I do know when we're interacting with workers, I mean, it might sound sort of like fluffy, but like the impact it's having on one's job performance, for example, can be an indicator of severity, right? I mean, if a worker is coming in and has a hard time, begins just feeling slight discomfort, but over time it becomes anxiety, and it becomes extreme anxiety, which we've actually experienced that with a lot of different workers reporting that. We actually track these things when we interact with workers. And I would say over 85% of workers we've interacted with experience some kind of anxiety disorder as a result of what they're experiencing within the workspace. And it's not always articulated that way, right? That's not what I'm saying. Most of the time it's like, well, I can't sleep at night, or I have racing thoughts, or I dread walking into work, right? The kind of things that we hear and we're like, oh, that's normal. Like, who loves going into work? But no, like some folks really dread going into work because of what they will experience, right? When they interact with the executive director or their higher up. That is something to pay attention to. Yeah.
I like that a lot too. I want to pause there for a second and say, have you found times when you're like, see, well, I don't know why you get a cheering crowd and I don't. I mean, it's just not fair, Shani.
Thanks for reframing that.
New parent. I'm getting very good at reframing. Do you have like, are there times when you're like, look, some of that anxiety might just be it's time for you as the employee. You just might not like this work anymore. It just might be it's time for you to find that next opportunity, as opposed to no. This is a problem with like leadership. Do you have that? Do you know when that split happens? Because I imagine there's times when it's both, right? Like I'm anxious because like I really should just move on. I'm a challenge.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we tend to, as like within our cooperative, a lot of the workers that reach out to us tend to be from nonprofits or helping institutions, and so we do know that burnout rates are real within these fields. And also, right, we also know that there is, and this is not a popular opinion, but there is also a lot of abuse of power within these institutions because there is not a heck of a lot of oversight, right? When we're talking about the board, for example, what we found in our organizing work is a lot of boards are in the back pocket of the executive directors. A lot of them are friends and they move in the same circles. So when workers reach out to us, we're not looking for like, is this just a burned out worker? It's not. We're listening and we're believing them, and that's never that's never brought us in a wrong direction ever. What we tend to find is that when one worker reaches out, they're able to then mention at least a few other workers that are experiencing similar things. Now, whether or not those workers are willing to come forward is another thing. And I think that often makes the difference between an active organizing campaign or being able to bring forth a grievance just within the organization's processes and being believed or remaining silent.
I think that's applause from the crowd. Fernando, I'm super interested in these two experiences, the worker's journey and the board journey, because I think Shani makes a dead-on point. There are some times when, as a board, you probably have to challenge yourself of are we just like kind of coming to the board meetings because there's hummus dip and we're just kind of like here, or are we really challenging this executive director and we have a good handle on their performance? Is that something you've bumped into or heard kind of stories of how boards don't even recognize that they're not doing their core responsibilities?
Sure. So let me go back to, Shani says fluffy. I think fluffy is really important. The challenge is because one little fluffy incident, it's nothing, slough it off. But lots of incidents, the comprehensive picture of bad behavior on the part of the executive directors, lots of little fluffy things, equals my not being able to sleep, my not being anxious. So back to Shani's starting, documented, but also articulated. Why cannot I sleep? Why am I anxious?
Mm-hmm.
Why can't I go to work? And so the documentation, but the trying to put on paper, what is it? And then Chris, you used the word leadership. So what is it about this person that is leader-ish or lack of leadership? I get interrupted when I speak. I'm not getting extra time to work, so I'm not making more money, or I'm not. He doesn't explain things to me. So what are the things that is making my life so bad, such that I need to talk to somebody, or is it just me? Now,
Mm-hmm.
Lots of articles have been written on leadership qualities, and it depends on the context. But communication is key. So does the executive director communicate with the staff on from big to small, from vision, values to, if I work in a grocery store, the apples always go in this bin, not the other, and not calling people names. So again, it's all the context. But back to the board, I'll go back to how we started this conversation. What is the process by
Mm-hmm.
which the executive director communicates with the board and vice versa? Often that happens at board meetings once a month, every other month, quarterly. But then also, what is the process by which the executive director communicates with the chair of the board? Do they meet, just the ED and the chair of the board, every Friday to go over certain items? Do they never meet? And again, what has been the evaluation process to date? Uh, and by the way, and then that's another topic, is the evaluation one-on-one, me, the board chair, and you, Chris? Is it the executive committee and the executive director? Is it 360, which is very onerous, but every so often, organizations could do 360, where they talk to board members. What are your perceptions of the ED? Horizontals, other leaders of nonprofits that the executive director interacts with, and then the person that the executive director supervises, the staff themselves. So again, how did we get here? And
Mm-hmm.
these are things that the board could be, processes that the board could be thinking about. Before I forget, I do want to say again, the topic is ousting, and if the person's really terrible, you need to get rid of them. But there are other considerations too. And what is the external communications that we're going to share with people when we do this? Often we say so and so wants to spend more time with their family. Okay, but we need to think of funders in the nonprofit sector, funders, donors, clients, staff. Just the legacy of the organization. So how do you want to frame the ousting of this person? And again, I go back to, how did we even get here? Was the board asleep at the wheel?
Right.
Was there no process? And even one notch before, what were the attributes that this person said they had, such that they didn't have it and we made a bad hire? So all of these things are integrated. The things you do before the hire, the interview of the hire, and while the person is working, did we, the board, evaluate, mentor, support this person and try to make them the best they could be?
Right. So let's actually turn to that. So let me help us out and say we've done our homework. We got our incident log together. We found this is beyond one incident. It's a few different employees, so we don't think this is just an employee who's burnt out and it's time to move on. But there's like a consistent sense of there's something wrong. Board is picking up on this, perhaps, maybe, but workers definitely have a sense. These sides have not yet talked. There's not a sense that the board and workers have any feeling together. But let's say there is a sense that we think something's up. Either it's just a lot of, to use this joke term, there's a lot of fluffy things, or we're talking there's a sense of malfeasance. There was a series of racial or sexual or even financial mismanagement. We think there's budgetary concerns, a range of different serious. The point is, we're at that point where sure we can do the digest later, but now we want to move forward and we feel like we need to at least do something. Let's use that now as the next stage of we've done our homework. We think we've been fair to the executive director. We think this is the right this is the right decision, knowing that we shouldn't oust everyone ever, but we do now think this is appropriate. Let's move to that stage. And I guess, yeah, Fernando, maybe let me like pause. Let me do the legal step to knowing that I won't put the pressure on you. You don't have to give. This is not formal legal advice, but just a framework of. I'm sure if I was an employee looking at this and saying, I want to talk to people about wanting my executive director to be removed, I might have some personal concern about legal threat to me or elsewhere. Are there themes that folks should be thinking about, knowing that this is not formal legal advice?
Yeah, sure. And again, it depends on the context. So,
Yeah.
just like human beings go through phases, baby, toddler, teenager, adult, wise old woman, so do nonprofits go through phases. So some nonprofits may have a personnel manual. And as alluded to before, they might even have template contracts. So thing to do, number one, if we have a personnel manual, to answer your question, Chris, what does the personnel manual say as to the steps that are required in order to discharge someone? What did the contract say? The 3 strikes and you're out. First, we talk to you.
And Fernando,
and
just to pause, your point is, of course, like the executive director is an employee just like anyone else. So your point is for if there's an employee manual that could just show how anyone could be laid off, fired, then it would also make sense for the executive director. That's kind of your point there.
Absolutely. And not only that, and then the personnel manual will explain, and then we haven't talked about what if this situation is happening in an organization that has a union. Now, typically the executive director is management, not union, but there are systems in place, and that's all I'm saying. To be cognizant of the systems in place, or lack thereof, in an organization and make sure that we follow them. And then make sure, of course, that we're not letting people go because of any protected category, because then that person's going to file a lawsuit and said, I'm a perfect person. I'm like Mary Poppins. And yet they ousted me because of my race, religion, sexual orientation. In some cities and states that's covered, etc. So we need to think about these issues, and those are things that a board has to have in the back of the mind. And I would start with the executive committee of a board. That's a statement I make, assuming that the board has such a thing called an executive committee. So I'm assuming a lot of stuff here in my discussions with you. But there systems in place at the board level, basically, is the bottom line. And there's like an executive committee, an evaluation process, and are there systems in place at the staff level, contracts, personnel manuals that will help guide this awkward situation that we're in.
Shani, I'm hoping to turn to you, because another thing I want to touch on is the idea of power dynamics, and I'm mostly thinking from the worker's perspective. I suppose there also could be for the board, but if I'm an employee and I'm thinking about this, or if I'm a board member and I'm being approached by an employee, what are like power dynamics I should be thinking about?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a great question, and I think power dynamics are always at play in every moment, and it shifts from context to context. But as a worker, right, we, especially frontline workers who come forward with these grievances, right, we know that typically, at least in the campaigns we've been a part of and helped to organize, frontline workers tend to have like the least amount of decision-making power within the organization, right? Do the most laborious work for the least pay, right? We know that they are not typically a part of decision-making processes. And so we know that because these everyday power dynamics are in place, right? It does impact, first of all, confidence levels of many workers to come forward if there is an issue, in fact. And secondly, the reality is, and we're usually this direct with workers that approach us, like the reality is there is risk. So if, ideally we could say, there are laws on the books, which this is true, and I'm not an attorney, but what we know as organizers having to engage the law, when we do this work, that protects, 2 or more workers that come forward under concerted activity, right? It doesn't mean that an executive director will not retaliate, just because under the law they are in fact breaking the law if they do retaliate, if a sound grievance is brought forward, right? And so we know that risk is constant and will not go away. And so if workers decide to organize or they decide to come forward in a formal process, it is important for all of the possibilities to be on the table so that folks can make informed decisions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If I could pick up on what Shani said, risk is really important, especially with particular types of populations. And I work closely with immigrant, documented and both undocumented. And so depending on your immigration status, speaking out poses a humongous risk because my boss could call the immigration service, or even if I'm documented, there's a whole bunch of problems. And then, as Shani said, there are laws, whistleblower laws, that in theory, protect workers if they blow the whistle on bad systems or a bad manager. But that's the theory, and the practice is different. But it's hard to get staff to come up and say what's been going on that's making their life so miserable. But I think, I'm just going to repeat, I'm a broken record. Communication is key. How has the boss communicated regularly with the staff so that they are part of the decision-making process? Does the spouse talk to the spouse? Does the parent talk to the child? Does the boss talk to the workers? So that everyone feels that we're part of this team. And I go back to, how did we get to the situation? Was there a total breakdown in talking between the board and the ED and the workers among themselves? What are the leadership qualities of this person, or lack of, that have brought us to this point today?
So let's turn to perhaps some case studies, even just examples, hypotheticals, whatever feels most effective. But I'm assuming that if I'm on the worker side, one of my steps. Well, actually, I really don't know that. Shani, in your work, does it make sense for me to go to internal HR, even if I'm at a small organization and someone is effectively doing HR, or to board member first? But let's say I have my incident log, I have a few employees. We do feel like there's something real here. This is more than just petty grievances, but this is serious. Do I go to HR type person, ED, board? What have you found as an effective tool, knowing that, as Fernando notes, there are, of course, lots of organizations of lots of different sizes, so we're painting with a pretty broad brush, but any patterns you've seen that have been successful? Oh, and I'm sorry, unmute. Sorry.
No problem, thank you. So again, another really great question. I mean, I think that it depends on the culture of the agency or the organization. Yeah. Sometimes if it's a small organization, sometimes the HR person is a good friend of the ED, or they are working on the same side. And I hate to say this, but most of the time we've seen that HR folks are working on the same side as the executive director. And so there are other tools in the toolbox, right? PCHR, the Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations, is an office that we work with a lot. So much so that they got to know us every time we showed up with a worker, because we do systems advocacy. And the feedback that we got is that showing up to PCHR and assisting workers in understanding how to fill out these forms, because sometimes it comes down to like understanding how to craft a narrative, right? And not in a sense of dishonesty, but in a sense of clarity, in a sense of being able to break down in a way that is coherent, folks to understand what it is you're experiencing. And of course, when you've experienced something traumatic, and we define workplace violence as traumatic, it can be hard to recall details. Sometimes you need that support. And so being able to reach out to offices like PCHR and reach out to, I know unions were mentioned earlier, although I definitely support unions, and as a Black queer person who works a lot with Black and brown, queer, and trans folks, we know unions have a lot of work to do. So for our community pockets, we've really had no choice but to really create power and capacity amongst ourselves. But back to the question, right? PCHR, understanding that if there is, sometimes, we'll talk to a worker and they'll say, there is this one board member who seems to understand that there are issues, right? You can test the waters, right? Because, I mean, again, there's those power dynamics in place, but perhaps reaching out to that board director and maybe just mentioning that you've noticed some things, and then gauging the response of that board director, or board member. If that board member responds in a way that doesn't actually feel all that supportive, maybe pull back, right? And especially if it's if you're afraid of losing your job or being retaliated against or micromanaged, which we see as retaliatory a lot of the time. And understanding that there are strength in numbers. And so there's a number, you talked about case studies. Well, I guess one of the biggest campaigns we worked on that most folks know about is the Mazzoni campaign, right? The Mazzoni campaign was all worker power, right? That was completely worker power. That was workers coming together and saying, we are not going to take this anymore in the light of sexual abuse allegations happening within that agency. Dr. Wynn was accused of quid pro quo policies with patients. Nurit Shine, who was the CEO at the time, knew about what was happening and did nothing for the workers. That resulted in a lack of trust, right? And so there's something that we sometimes call like a zero, like a no confidence petition almost, right? Where you draft up, and a lot of our work has been like this. We draft up petitions, we put in onto that petition what the who the target is, what they have done to lose confidence of the workers, and then one step by step, the workers break down what that ED has done or not done to create a space of integrity within that organization. And then, of course, lastly, that petition then is served to the board as well as the executive director. That resulted in a big win at Mazzoni Center several times. So it is, of course, scary when we are marginalized folks. And thinking about our livelihood and thinking and attaching organizing to where we make our money to survive. And also, we have to remember that regardless of what is on paper, the workers are the ones who hold power in any organization. And so if we can get a critical mass to come forward, and as my Tyler said, yay, right? Yay for strength in numbers, right? If we can get a critical mass to come forward, right? There is always a possibility of ousting that executive director. And that's exactly what happened at Mazzoni Center. Nurit Shine, former CEO, now she was ousted, along with Dr. Wynn, and some board members also stepped down in light of that.
I want to call out that I do hear toddler shouting in exultation whenever you talk about workers' power. So I think there's some household lessons learned. But I want to, Shani, I want to call out a theme that I've heard you touch on a few times is trust your feeling. Like you kind of alluded to, if you do, it's possible that you have a good relationship. There's a board member who does come to a lot of activities and you do feel like there's solidarity there. Or if your HR person does actually do, their job, they should be pretty independent. So maybe you do have an HR team member who is pretty independent. Like that is what that person's supposed to be. So I hear Shani kind of hitting home that you have to trust your gut. If you don't trust HR, if you don't trust anyone on the board, okay, that it's a real problem, but you might want to pause here as a worker and assess the tools you have. If you've got the log, if you've gotten some teammates, where is that next step of HR or board member whom you do think you have trust? If there ain't nothing there, okay, then for sure, as Shani's alluding to, you get fewer tools. Yeah, let's go back to Shani. Yeah.
One thing I just want to add, in speaking about PCHR, what we've learned is that if there is a few workers that come from the same agency and file with PCHR, that can be sort of a soft way to start, collectively building power together, because PCHR will flag like, oh, there are more than one worker from this agency. There's 5 or 6 workers from this agency filing a grievance for similar reasons. So they start to look at that very closely, right? And often that process takes months to unfold and sometimes longer. So that gives workers a chance to safety plan, to line up plan Bs because we worked with plenty of workers that are like, no, I'm ready to organize. And if I lose this job, I've already planned, kind of what I can do in the interim while I'm organizing.
For local folks, I threw here in the bottom, we have the Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations. That's what Shani is referencing there, PCHR. So that could be a resource to check out. So, okay, so let's keep driving forward here. You've made contact with someone either HR or board if there is that trust. If not, you've perhaps worked with another organization. It could be PCHR. It could be Black and Brown Workers Cooperative. You could have gotten that kind of touch point and some guidance. Fernando, I want to kind of go to you because you've rightly called out of a big part of this. If you still think your nonprofit's core mission is important, and we might assume you do if you're working there, you might think that the actual work is important. You flagged you don't want to lose sight of a messy transition here could have impact on the nonprofit and the people you serve, and that is something you often freak out. You often mention we want to talk about. Can you touch a little bit about that idea of other contingencies you have to keep in mind?
Sure, but first I want to agree with Shani of the importance of the Philadelphia Commission on Human Relations. I was honored to have served as a commissioner for a while, and Ruth Landau, the head, is still there. However, the commission focuses on staff who feel they've been discriminated on certain protected grounds. If you they may not have, the commission may not have the jurisdiction if your claim is not tied to, I feel I was fired because of my race, religion, etc.
Got it.
So one thing. Secondly, in theory, it would be great to go to the board. I'm a worker. My boss is crazy, cray. But often board bylaws say that the buck stops with the executive director. So if Shani and I are working in the same restaurant, you go up the chain of command and maybe the buck stops with the executive director. But what if my problem is with Shani, who's the head of the organization? Then maybe I can go to the board. But often the board bylaws, and this is again where we have to look at process, it says yes, and if you have a problem with horizontal, the executive director is the last word, but if it's with the executive director, come to X or committee Y of the board. So again, that's why workers have to, unfortunately, the responsibility lies on workers to read the personnel manual, read the bylaws, to see what's the process to protect myself as a worker. So anyway, so that's that. Now, to answer your question, Chris, there's a and Shani's point of Mazzoni, which I love, absolutely on point. But then they hired a third person, and I'm only talking about what I read in the Philadelphia Gay News. The third person they hired after Steve Wynn, Nurit Shine, then this was a Latina cis woman. But there was lack of communication, as I understand it, between the board and the staff before they hired her. So then the staff had issues with her. So what was the process that the board used to communicate? Was the board involved in the hiring of this third executive director? And then, what was the process that the board used with this final executive director? Because the staff were absolutely not happy, and they organized. And then she resigned, as I understand it. Again, I'm only parroting what I read. But the communication, it's all about relationships. Communication between the ED and the staff, and between the board and the executive director. So finally, Chris, to your question. So when we let someone go, so we've been focusing on tricks and techniques and things to think about. But one other thing to think about is just what do we tell the world? So there are a number of foundations, and as nonprofits, we all rely on foundations that will not make a grant to a nonprofit if there's a transition in place. I'm not saying, bite your tongue, don't fire this person until the grant from XYZ Foundation comes in, and then, oust his ass. But funders, like, what do we say? Fiscal years, what are we doing? Do we have time for someone to come in and shadow? Maybe we don't want anyone to shadow this really bad person. What do we tell the media as to why this person is leaving? What do we tell our clients? What do we tell our current and former donors so that people continue to have trust in us? And trust is a word that's come up here. So how do we tell the people, especially clients like Mazzoni, hey guys, still come in. We are still going to give you medical services despite the craziness that has been going on. So how do we frame all this? And that's like where you as a communications expert or some other person needs to come in and tell the story so that people feel that they can, so that funders, clients, etc., the media still has trust that this organization can still deliver the service that it was meant to deliver.
And we're coming on time, but I want to make sure to turn to Shani on this one too. I'll actually just offer, I've a couple times now seen the behind the scenes process of a few organizations doing some version of transition, and I've seen some good ones and some less good ones. But I've seen the Google Doc that appears if there's a functioning relationship between board and a couple workers that might say, all right, we got the ED situation happening, but we still think our core mission is vital, and so we want to run through these things that we are worried about. And Fernando hit on a couple. Like, we're worried about some funders that were deeply close tied to our executive director. We want to make sure to convey we still think our work is crucial. We have some processes that could break if that executive director is removed suddenly. And it kind of like walked through. And I think that's worth noting, that you can get this very important and noble and beautiful high about saying there was a power dynamic that we brought down, and that in many cases is very good. But I presume you also care about the mission you're working on, and you don't want to lose sight of that, which is a theme I hear Fernando saying. Shani, I got to feel like you've been close to a lot of these sort of situations. Are there like contingencies or things that folks aren't thinking about that you want them to be thinking about during this process?
Sure, but first I need to address the Mazzoni statement, because I feel like what is very important to remember here around Mazzoni, and I have to point out that Lydia, the second one that was reinstated, that was also through community organizing that Lydia actually had to step down. So in both instances, that sort of uplifted the power of the workers. I don't want to leave the Mazzoni Center campaign on that note, because we understand that it was the workers that shifted power at Mazzoni. We also assisted workers in getting unionized at Mazzoni. So we did not just do that campaign and leave, right? I think that's very important for the community to know that's listening in on this. So of course there are going to be, we live in a culture that is anti-worker, period. We do not live in a country where we have laws that support workers. So anytime we take a strong stand and we speak out and we consolidate our power and we orchestrate, collective bargaining power, of course there's going to be residual impact. There just will, until we are able to actually shift some of the policies that are on paper and actually reinstate and build up confidence in different kinds of unions, because we still have there's issues with unions, as I have stated before. So that's very important. I needed to lift that up. Now to your question. So, I mean, in terms of the mission, right? Again, and I can only speak from the perspective of a cooperative that focuses on marginalized workers, right? And so we know that often in these helping agencies, which I can get into it here, but we don't have enough time, right? The legacy of helping industrial complex, okay? So we know that within these spaces, right, that often the mission that is put forth is being undermined by the abuse of power. Okay, so when we organize as workers, when we call out and name these systems of oppression, that is actually challenging that institution to live up to their stated values. Now we know that when funding can absolutely be challenged because of organizing, but also, right, we've worked with many spaces and workers that are able to make connections with the funders, right? Part of the organizing work many times is finding out who is this executive director and people in power getting money from? Where is this getting funneled from? And then we're able to be in direct communication as workers with these spaces, whether it's through letters, whether it's through putting in phone calls and saying, listen, this is what's happening at our agency. We are taking a stand because of what folks have experienced here. And we believe that this actually negatively impacts the community that this organization says it serves. We are asking you to keep this in mind as you make decisions about funding. We are asking you to perhaps think about alternative ways to engage our particular organization around deciding whether or not we get funds again. Now, of course, like I said, when there are campaigns or organizing happens or workers build collective power, there might be a hit to funding, right? But if there is, let that be a lesson and a message for folks in power there that this cannot happen any longer, because they are the ones hurting the work. It's not the workers that hurt the mission when the workers come forward to file a complaint or to organize. Right?
Well said.
So if there is any issue with funding, we have to look at the people who have created the problem.
Very well said. That's perhaps a good way to close out. Look at support all around. But I want each of you to take maybe a last swing. Anything you want to make sure folks walk away with, Fernando, and then I'll come back to you, Shani. We went through a lot. I want to remind everyone this is a starting point. This is not the complete dissection of how to do this. But Fernando, anything that you want to make sure folks, really get home after watching this?
Well, I think, I'd like to use two words that Shani used, and I think maybe that's what this discussion is about: culture and values. So what is the culture in this place such that it allows for us to speak our mind? Does the executive director have from the top down and from grassroots and grass tops up? Is there a culture here that we can talk to each other, that we can be honest with each other? Is there a culture of staff meetings, for example? Is there a culture where the executive director nurtures us? And is there a culture of the board talking to the executive director and figuring out, are the community's needs represented? Many organizations have 3 statements, and often it's on your website. A vision statement, which is aspirational. We're never going to get there. Like, we believe in a world without AIDS. Maybe we'll get there one day. Then values. We believe in transparency, diversity, equity, inclusion, etc. And then the mission statement. And so so what are these values? If we really believe in transparency, in honesty, how does the executive director and the staff and the board live and implement these values? So what is the culture of the organization that we're in, and how is it living its values? And if anything, hopefully the folks listening in could reflect a little bit. Again, these are topics that Shani opened the door on. What is the culture of this organization? What are the values? And not just the 4 or the 5 clauses or sentences that appear on the website, but how are these values being implemented? As a teacher, like many teachers, I work with nonprofits and government agencies. And often this is one thing that we talk about when I walk them through a planning process or a staff or board development process. Like, what are the values? And do they really come to life, or is this just bullshit?
Well said. Shani, help bring us home. Last things that you want to make sure folks walk away with. It's me again. Sorry. Yes. Go ahead.
No problem. Trust your intuition and start there. I mean, we often as workers labor in spaces that tell us to do what we're told, and follow the rules, right? And whether they say it with a smile or not, that's usually still the culture in place. And so understand that what you feel matters, what you are experiencing matters, and start with that incident log. Know that you are not alone. There are spaces that you can reach into confidentially. The Black and Brown Workers Cooperative is one of those places, and you do not have to identify as Black or Brown to reach into us, and so that we can just support you in the ways that you might need. And then finally, I do want to say, I will always believe this, this is part of my soul contract work on this earth, right? The worker is all powerful. And we have to know that it is the workers that give credibility to these agencies. The ones who do the most laborious work and usually have the least amount of voice, you are the lifeline of these agencies. And so sometimes when we build collective power and we organize together, it is a reminder for those in power where the power actually lies.
That's a way to go. I threw up the Black and Brown Workers Cooperative website there for folks who want to learn more information there. Fernando, Shani, thank you so much for your time and expertise. This will be running on Generosity. We'll also make the link available in the comments here below on YouTube. Thanks so much for being here, guys, and we'll see you next time.